now. Today, we're going to pick up where we left off and continue discussing parties and party systems in Latin America. And we'll be talking a lot about party system fragmentation, but also institutionalization and ideological polarization, questions about how far parties are from each other ideologically, how many parties there are. We'll take a look at some cases and do some case studies, think about examples, think about the range of experiences in Latin America. And in general, I hope that it's a useful discussion for you because we get a chance to take a look at some of the sharp differences between different types of systems. And yet again, it's a way for us to see how the politics of diversity really plays out in real time in Latin American countries. Now, before we do that, I want to discuss a current event that is very, very near and dear to me and something that should inspire all of us, despite everything else that's happening in the world and despite all the reasons we have to be unoptimistic about the future. Latin America is in the news. It's always in the news. It's a huge region. It's very important. But it's in the news in a very important and inspiring way. And the news comes from Chile, where voters recently participated in an election to vote on whether they should draft a new constitution. And then secondarily, whether the drafters of the new constitution should be members of a constitutional assembly directly elected by the people or composed of members of the Congress. And Chileans voted in extraordinary numbers, and in a landslide victory, they voted to draft a new constitution and dispense with the 1980 constitution from the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. And not only that, but they voted in outstanding numbers to elect a constituent assembly that will be composed of, wait for it, 50% women and 50% men. And this entire process is just extraordinary. And I could go on for hours talking about this and how important this is and what it represents, but I'll try to keep my comments short. Now, many of you already know that the 1980 Constitution in Chile created a very free market model that included very few state protections. If you're a Chilean, you pay for everything, and it's very expensive. It's funny, you go there, you can't even find a public bathroom. You've got to pay money to use the baño. Taking the interstate or the highway is extremely expensive because everything is privatized. All the utilities are privatized and you've got to pay high rates. Much of spending in Chile is done through credit, and Chileans have to get all sorts of credit cards just to afford basic things. All of this was made reality by the 1980 Constitution, which created a very free market friendly model and reduced the role of the state to virtually providing for property rights and about nothing more. And in addition, that constitution made it very difficult to change the rules of the game in Chile and to change the economic institutions of the free market model or the political institutions of the democratic system that included a whole range of supermajority requirements and other protections designed to limit change. The cumulative effect of this constitution has been economic growth on the one hand, but extraordinary economic inequality on the other hand. And the very, very large gap between the rich and the poor in Chile has meant that huge swaths of society cannot exercise basic social and political rights. And it means that people have been profoundly dissatisfied with both government and parties and Congress and the capacity of the economic model to provide for them in a way that is even marginally supportive. And so the other day, they had a chance to vote on bringing about a new constitution through either of the two means that are available to them, the Constituent Assembly or the Congress. And they voted in the affirmative to create a new constitution and to create that Constituent Assembly. Now, the mood in Chile and in Santiago in particular is joyous, and they're extraordinarily pleased with this outcome. And I'll talk to you in a little bit about why they're so pleased and where they came from to get here. But first, let's take a look at a video that puts in perspective their response to this news. And I'm going to pause the recording for a moment so that YouTube doesn't take down my video when I post this. So I'm going to pause.
The bonuses that will always occur when you reform from a military constitution is you're decreasing the role of the military in society, because you're sort of moving away from the bureaucratic authoritarianism of the past and sort of allowing the majority that's currently in society today to sort of figure out what issues they need to work on instead of focusing on a legacy of the past.
Okay, so you're getting rid of those legacies of authoritarian rule in the first place. In Chile, those include those supermajority requirements that make it so hard to change legislation. It includes certain institutional privileges that the armed forces enjoy, uh, but it also includes, the economic institutions that were put in place at that time too, including very tight restrictions on the participation of the state in sectors like energy or utilities. All of these things represent big changes that would be a reversal of years and years of policy. And so that movement away from that authoritarian era, that's a significant change because it's a transformation that is it is a long time coming, and it's a transformation of a system that has been relatively successful in some regards, but very, very, very unsuccessful in others. And so, for instance, it's been very helpful in some ways in promoting economic growth, but it's been very, very bad in promoting social development. And so, one thing a new constitution would need to include is stronger guarantees and protections for social rights, access to healthcare, higher education. And these things are things that the free market model did not do well. And so a new constitution would have to carve out a bigger role for the state in promoting social development. I anticipate that some of these comments are because I wasn't recording, but I did resume the recording. Oh, actually, no one said anything about it. Okay. So I'm going to read some of these comments, unless someone wants to take the mic and make a comment first. Maricela says, if Chile isn't a high-income country, what makes them think that their people could afford to pay all fees? Good question, Maricela. I think that in this case, they put in place a system that they maybe thought could produce wage gains substantial enough through economic growth that people could pay the fees to purchase privatized services. But in reality, what often happens is when there's a significant power imbalance between capital and labor, which is the case in Chile, there tends to be abuses on the part of the capitalists and those who control the distribution and the production of those services, and they usually raise rates significantly. And so what begins with maybe an ideological justification of, oh, well, growth will allow for revenue gains that can help to pay those fees, can often turn into a much more exploitative system where people can't pay them and they end up rising up and rebelling in huge numbers as a result. Abel says, amazing. It is amazing. It's incredible. On a given day in Santiago, 1.5 million people assembled peacefully and demanded a new constitution. And this is a show of force that is absolutely astonishing. And the strength of groups like unions, employers associations, teachers unions, students, feminists, these groups are some of the best organized social movements in the world. And it's because Chilean society is very, very strong and robust and well organized in these groups. And they're very, very articulate, and they define their goals very, very specifically. And the feminist group in particular has been very successful in shaping the terms of the Constitutional Convention, and especially with regard to the 50-50 composition of the body, women and men. That's the first constitutional convention in the world that will consist of equal numbers of men and women. Maricela says, as I'm watching the video, my only concern is the safety of the people since some of them are not wearing a mask. This is true, Maricela. We have to be concerned about the social distancing. I think they're just so thrilled with the outcome, they can't contain themselves. Uh, Maricela says, I believe that the new constitution, if created, will take time to get implemented. Certainly it will. And these things always take time. And it actually won't be until 2022 that they will get down to writing that new constitution. Um, or at the very latest, it could be 2001, and maybe they're voting in 2002. I can't remember, or 2022, excuse me. But yeah, it will take time. But compared to the 30 years or the 40 years that the country's been under the 1980 Constitution, waiting a couple years is a very small price to pay. Okay, so this is an example of transformation in Latin America that should interest us greatly. And I think that we can look at this as an example of moving forward and the ways that these societies continue to transform themselves, and often in ways that maybe the literature doesn't expect. And by that, I mean that the important role of social movements in organized popular masses, uh, that's a role that's not well understood. And the Chilean case is an example of how ordinary people can actually bring about astonishing change. And the last thing I'll say is that in Chile, a new constitution was on no one's agenda. No one thought that was possible. And yet they did that. And they did that because of people power and because of popular protest and popular mobilization. And so we should be thrilled. Okay, so we're returning to our lecture about party systems and party system fragmentation, institutionalization, ideology, polarization. These are all issues that we've been discussing. And I thought that it would be useful for us as we get back into it to take a look at an example of a fragmented party system. And I want to show you what we mean when we say that the party system is fragmented. Now, what I have before you is a list of political parties with representation in the Peruvian Assembly, the Peruvian Congress. I also have the list of parties that controls the presidency. And I have the percentage of the overall seats in the assembly. This is from 2020. This is the most recent electoral result in Peru. And what you'll notice is that in the Congress, there are, let's see, how many parties? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 parties. 9 political parties have representation in the Congress. And this doesn't even include the set of parties that didn't cross the 5% threshold. And that's like 5 or 6 parties. But in addition to the fact that there are 9 of these parties, you notice that not a single one of them, with the exception of just Popular Action, won more than 10% of the vote. Every single party on this list, including Popular Action, is relatively weak. Not relatively weak, very weak. In fact, one political scientist from Peru is quoted as saying, everyone is weak and anything can happen. Notice also that Peruvians for Change, the party that won the presidency, doesn't even have any congressional representation. This is a quintessential example of a fragmented party system. We have a lot of just sort of piecemeal, morselized parties, right? Parties that have a very small share of the vote and are numerous. No party stands out from the others. No party has a large plurality. No party has a majority. Certainly no party has a supermajority. Instead, they all fight for a relatively tiny proportion of the overall legislative constituency. And that tiny portion doesn't put any of them in a position to promote a legislative agenda or to be very decisive. Now, what that also means is that the Peruvians for Change administration, the presidential administration, in order to pursue its legislative agenda, would have to piece together a coalition that would at the very least probably include 5 parties. The reason is because you've got to cross the 50% threshold to get a majority. And with parties this weak, any coalition would have to include a large number of them. But think about how hard it is to get all of your different friends to agree on what to do on a Friday or a Saturday night. With two people, it's relatively easy. With three people, it gets harder. With four people, it gets even harder. With five people, it's almost impossible to agree on what to do. Everyone has a different agenda. You've got different interests, different things that you might be trying to accomplish, different objectives. This is what it's like to try to put together a coalition in a place like Peru, where again, everyone is weak and anything can happen. And so these parties, they include Popular Action, who has 10% of the vote. They include Podemos Peru, who has 8.5%. The Agricultural People's Front has 8.5%. The Alliance for Progress has 8%. Their Purple Party has about 7.5%. Popular Force has 7.31%. Union for Peru has about 7%. In the Broad Front and We Are Peru both have about 6%. That's a very difficult situation for any legislature and any president. Yes, Ishan, so the president's party got no seats. So Leonardo, that's a good question. Why don't any of those parties team up and dominate? This is the key question. Why don't they do that? Doesn't it make sense to combine forces and to come together and to pursue goals that both of you agree on or that both of you can agree on? Well, when we think about it, it seems to make good sense, right? It seems super intuitive. These parties should get together and form a larger party and then dominate. But what we'll see later is that it's not that simple, because in a very diverse society like Peru, you've got a lot of different interest groups and a lot of different social and ethnic groups who have different allegiances, different commitments. They've got different ideas. They've got different interests. And what's more, when it's difficult to strengthen any one party, you get a lot of individual personalities who are willing to peel off and form their own party for the purpose of trying to win power, or for the purpose of just kind of concentrating power in their hands and getting their own benefits. But the issue of heterogeneity and the diversity of the society in the interest groups goes a long way in helping us to explain this situation. But Leonardo's question is one that will frame the rest of our discussion. That question, why don't any of these parties team up and obliterate the rest of them? Another way to look at this is to look at the Peruvian legislature in terms of the representation of those individual parties. And I've got the list over here in Spanish, but what I want you really to notice is the sheer diversity in color across the full range of the assembly. What you see is that no party has a clear majority, and in fact, no party is very strong at all. All these different parties are represented, and they're all relatively equally represented, making it very, very difficult for any one party to succeed, if not impossible for any one party to succeed. Now let's contrast this with the situation in Uruguay. Now Uruguay is a classic example of what we might refer to as a consolidated party system. Now, you'll notice that there are still a number of parties in Uruguay. And moreover, there are even 3 parties in the lower house alone who have very few seats. But what I want you to notice is the spread of votes among the top 3 parties, the Broad Front, the National Party, and the Colorado Party. The Broad Front has 42 seats. The National Party has, no, that's percentage, my bad. 42% of the seats. The National Party has 30% of the seats. The Colorado Party has 13%. Then Open Cabildo has 11%. In the upper house of the Congress, or the Senate, it's even more concentrated. The Broad Front has 43%. The National Party has 33%. The Colorado Party has 13%. Open Cabildo has 1%. Now, we're calling this a consolidated party system, but in reality, it is a multi-party system, but it's relatively consolidated, at least compared to Peru. And in the sense that the 2 dominant parties, the Broad Front and the National Party, have relatively large vote shares. Notice that The third place party, the Colorado Party, only has 13%, less than half of the national party. Similar in the upper house, the Colorado Party has less than half of the national party's total vote count or vote share. It really is a contest between the broad front and the national party. Looking at this data, it looks like Uruguay probably has an effective number of parties of around 2.5, maybe 2.6 or 2.7. It's a relatively consolidated party system in that much of the vote share goes to these top two parties. Now you can see the difference between Uruguay, where we have the concentration of the vote share among the top two parties, and Peru, where you have literally like 6 parties who have between 7% and 10% of the total vote. The difference between these party systems could not be any more dramatic. That's a very, very sharp difference in the relative sort of consolidation or concentration of the vote share among certain parties. And we can look at this in a different way too. You'll notice that when represented as an image, Uruguay's upper and lower houses also look more consolidated because, again, we've got fewer parties, and the parties that have large vote shares have vote shares that are more than twice the percentage of the third place party. Relatively consolidated as far as Latin America is concerned. Now, of course, you can imagine a two-party system of the kind that existed in Venezuela and Colombia between about 1955 and about 1990. In those countries, you had essentially a liberal and a conservative party, and that was the case in Uruguay in the post-authoritarian period, the 80s and the 90s as well. So there's been some change in Uruguay, but Uruguay has always been a relatively consolidated party system, even if it doesn't have two parties who dominate the entire picture, like, say, Venezuela and Colombia between 1950 and 1990. Delianor says, for that to happen, someone would have to take down or submit to another group's goals and put their ideas on the back burner unless they could come to some type of agreement. Each party has their own agenda to push. This is so important. Delianor is exactly right. When we talk about combining forces to pursue a common goal, we confront and have to deal with what we call collective action costs. There's this problem that we call the collective action problem. And this relates to the difficulty that we face when we try to team up to pursue a common goal. And the difficulty comes from the fact that it's difficult to monitor the behavior of the others in the group, on the one hand. It's also difficult to organize the group as it gets larger. As the group gets bigger, organization costs rise. Thirdly, the different members of the group, the benefit that they get can be relatively small. And so it works against their willingness to cooperate. And then, of course, fourthly, there's the simple fact that different groups have different interests. And when they have different interests, that means then that one would have to submit to someone else if they weren't able to successfully compromise and negotiate and form an agenda where they are able to kind of trade off promoting each other's priorities so as to kind of scratch one back and then scratch the other. So it's difficult to form coalitions. And when there's that many parties with between 7 and 10% of the vote, it becomes even harder. And so you can imagine then why it's so frustrating to be a Peruvian president, and why in a place like Ecuador, until just very recently, it was also very, very difficult because Ecuador had a very similar situation. Now we arrive at this question, and this is a question a lot like what Leonardo asked. Leonardo said, why don't any of those parties team up and work together so that they can, really fill the void? And the question can be put a different way, and that question is, why might Uruguay have fewer political parties than Peru? And then on a more general level, why might some party systems in Latin America be more consolidated while others are more fragmented? Why is it that some party systems appear to be more sort of mature, if you will, while others appear to be more dispersed or sort of fragmented or kind of morselized, if you will? Well, I'd like to hear it from you first. What do you think might be going on here? What is it about Peru that makes it different from Uruguay? Or what is it about Uruguay that makes it different from Peru? This would be a most similar systems design. We have two similar countries with different outcomes: a fragmented party system in Peru, a relatively consolidated party system in Uruguay. Countries that otherwise share a whole number of characteristics, including a legacy of military rule, prior democratic history, former colonies. We can identify other similarities too. But what difference between these countries do you think might account for this difference? Do you have any ideas?
Could it be the presence or absence of a populist, or populist leader who would like try and sort of run above a party?
So can you think of an example from Peru who might fit that? It's possible that there could be some role for a populist leader who discredits parties. The one I can think about in recent memory is Alberto Fujimori from the 90s, who you know about. But I think that Fujimori, really, the extent of his effect probably ended in the early 2000s when he no longer was on the scene. And so for 2020 legislature to look the way it does and to still be so fragmented suggests that maybe there's something else going on, and that maybe a more recent factor is important. Maybe there's a more recent populist I don't know about, but there hasn't been another Fujimori quite like Fujimori in terms of populism and the extent of populism. Does anyone else have any other ideas?
Would you say that Uruguay is a richer country than Peru?
Yeah, it's a higher income country than Peru.
So in Peru, would something to consider be their economy? And perhaps there's a lot of parties promising change and promising a solution. Whereas in Uruguay, you have something more stable. And like we've talked about before, when things are stable, they're harder to change. Change isn't easily, given. But whereas when things are looking rocky, people are more acceptable to change. And perhaps that's why in Peru you have a lot of parties promising something for the people.
So it's possible that maybe there's something to do with the economy, and maybe better economic performance has made it possible to consolidate the party system in Uruguay and more difficult in Peru. That's definitely a possibility. We'd want to think harder, I think, about the mechanisms and how the condition of the economy would do that, and how it might prevent party system consolidation in Peru, but work differently in Uruguay where there's more growth. That's certainly a possibility. Other ideas? So I'd like to present to you a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that ethnic and racial homogeneity can be linked to party system consolidation. That is to say that societies that are relatively sort of similar internally, racially and ethnically, from person to person, will be more likely to develop these more consolidated party systems. And the reason that I'm suggesting that this is because Uruguay is among the most homogenous populations in South America. It's mostly Europeans from Spain and Italy. And there's a very small indigenous population and a very small Black population. And this homogeneity means that there are far fewer differences between groups, in that there's a enormous imbalance in the relative sizes of groups, with really minority groups being very, very small. And in the sort of European kind of Latin Americans in Uruguay being a large proportion of the population. And this is one possibility, because the literature suggests already that countries that are relatively homogenous in these ways will be more likely to develop these more consolidated party systems. Now, what's interesting is that in addition to being relatively homogenous in terms of its population and in terms of ethnicity and race, Uruguay is also relatively homogenous in terms of its geography. It's very flat for the most part, lots of plains, and in general, it doesn't have a lot of divisions between different parts of the economy that are concentrated in different areas of the country because of that geographic kind of uniformity across the country. So there's a lot of homogeneity in Uruguay. And the reason that I'm stressing the geography as well is because what that means is that there's less of a chance that local parties will emerge that represent local interests or a subset of interests, because interests are more often shared sort of nationally because of the consistency from place to place and the geographic similarities and the relative uniformity of the economy throughout the country. And so this is interesting because this is something from the literature that we can use to possibly explore Uruguay. But remember that we have another case here, and that case is Peru. And this is a most similar systems design. And what I want to do with you now is pose a question to you that gets at the heart of how to use the method of difference in the most similar systems design to make causal inferences and to make, more importantly, predictions about what hypotheses might explain certain outcomes. And so I want to ask you a single question that will help to tie together the use of this method to do this with the variation across the cases that we observe. And that question is as follows. How can we use the Uruguayan case of party system consolidation to hypothesize about what explains party system fragmentation in Peru? Now, let's take a moment to think about that. And please take this seriously and engage and be prepared to share your input in just a minute. But I'd like us to stop here and think about this before we get back together. So we'll take a few minutes. Okay, everybody. So I hope that your brains are moving and really tackling this. I'd like to hear from you though. What do you think? How can we use the Uruguayan case to explain the Peruvian case? And will you tell us either via the chat or via the microphone if you feel bold?
So, can one say that if racial homogeneity is linked to party system consolidation, like in Uruguay, then having a large diversity, like in Peru, leads to a party system fragmentation?
Yeah, absolutely. That's that's the inference that we would draw, and that's the hypothesis that we would sort of form based on the logic of this comparative design. And Leonardo, I gathered that you used the logic of the method of difference to reach that conclusion. So I'd imagine that your thought process went about like this. If Uruguay and Peru differ only in terms of the party system, and if Uruguay is consolidated and Peru is fragmented, and if Uruguay is racially and ethnically homogenous, and if that is linked to party system consolidation already in the theoretical literature, well, that suggests that the absence of racial and ethnic homogeneity in Peru might explain party system fragmentation there, since that would be sort of the reverse of that racial homogeneity variable. Is that about how your thinking went?
Yeah, but you just made it sound a lot better.
Oh, well, no, you arrived at the inference and that's what counts. But everybody, this is a good example of how we can use comparative methods to draw inferences. And what's neat about this example and this way of thinking about it is that we're not just comparing countries, we're actually using the literature as well. And as I pointed out, ethnic and racial homogeneity is already identified in the theoretical literature as a cause of party system consolidation. And the inverse of that, racial and ethnic heterogeneity, is linked to party system fragmentation. And so that's really, really important because we never go into our cases without some knowledge of what the theoretical literature already tells us. And so we take that knowledge into our case studies. And then we use that to kind of figure things out. And in this case, if Uruguay and Peru are comparable in this most similar systems design, and if the one difference between them is going to help to explain their different party system outcomes, and if racial homogeneity is linked to consolidation, but consolidation did not happen in Peru, well, that must mean that racial diversity is at work in Peru. And so this is a way for us to use all of these different things simultaneously. And it's a new way for us to think because it's a way for us to combine theory and methods and cases in a very unique way. And in particular, by using the literature in a way that we haven't previously. Quinn, this issue, do you mean ethnic and racial homogeneity or heterogeneity? Yeah.
Yes, I do.
So what did you hear about that?
Okay, I was going to type it, but I'll just say it. I think sorry if you can hear my background.
No worries.
I was taking comparative political parties last semester, and I think I remembered learning in Eastern Europe there was more racial heterogeneity, I think, if I remember correctly. I know for sure in Africa there was more racial heterogeneity than homogeneity, and they did not have a lot of consolidated party systems there.
Yeah. So in Eastern Europe and in Africa, there's a lot of ethnic diversity. And in particular in Eastern Europe,
Okay, thank you.
the Balkans, there are many ethnic groups. And this is often tied to religious and linguistic differences. And so some of the civil wars fought in Eastern Europe have been fought in these places with intense ethnic rivalries. And in Africa, they also have what we sometimes refer to as ethnic party systems, or ethnic parties, parties that represent ethnic groups, particular ethnic groups. And so in more heterogeneous societies, there are more of these ethnic parties. And sometimes these ethnic party systems can be very, very explosive and prone to dysfunction, because those ethnic alliances or those ethnic allegiances can often undermine democracy if groups perceive themselves as under threat, or if they place a higher emphasis on the survival of their group over the, maybe the integrity of the democratic system or the process. So, for example, in some places, there's been election violence waged between parties and groups that represent different ethnic groups. Kenya is one example. But these ethnic parties and these ethnic rivalries are often very much involved in this party system fragmentation, because every group has its own party, and sometimes groups have multiple parties, and moreover, the sort of the tensions between the parties can be very difficult to resolve. And so party system fragmentation does tend to go hand in hand with this kind of social and racial diversity. And so this is what we observe in Latin America too. Peru is one of the most heterogeneous societies in all of Latin America and all of the world, actually. And it's astonishing. You look at the composition of Peru in terms of ethnic groups. 60% of the population is mestizo. Mestizos are a mix of indigenous and whites. 25% are Amerindian or indigenous. 6% are white. 4% are black. What this means is there's a lot of variation, and there's even variation within the mestizo category, because some are more indigenous, some are more white. But the indigenous themselves are a large proportion of the society, and they also have parties of their own. But you compare this to, say, Uruguay, which is, as we already established, much more homogeneous, or much more sort of uniform racially and ethnically. Look what you find. Almost 88% of the population is white, less than 5% is black, less than 3% is indigenous. The situation could not be any more different in Uruguay. It suggests that Peru is more socially heterogeneous than Uruguay, in that heterogeneity is what explains party system fragmentation in Peru. And it suggests that it's that homogeneity in Uruguay that might explain that consolidation in Uruguay. Now, naturally, to actually study this, we would have to go into those cases and study testable implications of those hypotheses, and we'd have to do all sorts of process tracing so that we can be sure, or so that we can at the very least link these supposed causes with these different outcomes. But this evidence is suggestive, and it's also interesting to consider that Ecuador, which is very similar to Peru, also has a great deal of social, ethnic, and geographic diversity. And in particular, just like in Peru, there are differences between the coastal business community and the sort of inland business community, in addition to differences between indigenous groups, between non-indigenous and indigenous citizens, and also, of course, large populations of mestizos, large indigenous populations. You put all this together, and there's a tremendous diversity of views and opinions and interests, and it helps to explain why there's so much party system fragmentation, why every group seems to have its own party, why there are these differences between the cases. And so this is how we can help to explain Uruguay and Peru, and how we can help to explain in a very primitive sense some of the variation in party system fragmentation from country to country. But party system fragmentation, as a reminder, is really only one dimension of party systems and how we study them. I'm going to read some comments before we move on. Delianor adds, yes, in Africa there are tribal groups also. Yeah, this is really important too. There are local tribal groups, and sometimes there are warlords, or there can be strongmen or leaders who have significant power within groups, and these groups sometimes have their own parties, but at a bare minimum, it does seem to reflect again that diversity and that lack of uniformity inside many of these countries. We know that in the Latin American case, in the cases of countries like Peru and Ecuador, one legacy of colonialism was that the Spaniards left behind boundaries and borders in societies that were very, very diverse, and that didn't often have a lot of rhyme or reason to their construction or their composition. And we know that settlement by colonizers itself also contributed to these patterns as well, by contributing to mixing and by sort of widening the diversity of populations through the importation of slaves and all sorts of processes that would not have taken place had the colonizers not come in. Yeah, so as Quinn points out, not all of Eastern Europe is ethnically homogenous, as we might have seen because of its Ottoman legacy. Absolutely, and I admit that I don't know Eastern Europe as well as some other regions, and well, I'm teaching a class on Latin American politics, so that might reflect that. But Eastern Europe is often compared to Latin America because of the transitions there, and cases with that ethnic diversity can also be useful to study, especially if we want to learn more about countries like Bolivia or Ecuador or Peru, which are among the most diverse in the world. So the second,
Mr. Grimes, I have a question.
Yes, Leonardo.
So what about the US compared to Peru? Like, why is it that we don't have fragmentation here and we have a large diverse set of people?
I think maybe it's because our democracy is much older, perhaps. Is that a plausible explanation?
Well, my guess, to be honest with you, is that it has to do with the electoral system. We have majoritarian institutions where the winner of a district takes the whole constituency. And so a single representative represents the whole constituency, and we don't split up seats within a district according to the proportion of the vote won by different parties. And what that means is there's an incentive for voters to support the two parties that they think have the best chance of winning because they fear that they'll waste their vote otherwise. And so proportional representation, on the other hand, where seats are divvied up according to the proportion of the district won by parties, it gives voters much more confidence that their vote might actually count because all their preferred party has to do is win enough votes to cross a simple threshold of usually 5% of the total vote. And so voters are much more willing to vote for third and fourth and other parties. Proportional representation is more common in Latin America. Even though they have presidential systems, they use PR as an electoral system much more. And so my guess is that it has to do with the majoritarian institutions in the US and the fact that we have those winner-take-all elections. And I think that probably has a lot to do with it. And what we'll see later is that electoral reform in general is actually one cause of party system change, because when you change the electoral system and the way that votes are counted and the way that seats are divvied up, it changes the incentives that parties have to team up in the ways that Leonardo, you described. And so, for example, if you go from, say, a proportional representation system to a majoritarian system where you go from divvying up seats according to the proportion of the vote won to divvying up seats according to who won the plurality of the district, that gives parties a reason to team up, because now they're less likely to be competitive unless they become stronger and unless they represent, one of the top two parties. So electoral reform is really, really important. And in the US, one question that always comes up is, why do we only have two parties? Why can't we have more? Well, we have more. It's just that the only parties that are actually competitive and can actually win seats are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And that has mostly to do with the fact that voters vote rationally. And so they vote for those two parties out of fear that not doing so will contribute to the wasting of their vote.
Yeah, and there's no incentive for them to change the electoral system either because they would lose votes, right, Professor?
That's exactly right. So there are vested interests, and the groups that benefit from this system are the ones who are in a position to change it, and they don't want to change it because they benefit from it. And so this is often the catch-22. It's like we can imagine these social reforms and how they might help to improve the system, but the fact is the ones who serve as the gatekeepers are the ones who benefit from the existing system. And so how do you get them to change? Well, good question. You've got to change the costs and the benefits of change for them, and you've got to persuade them or alter the balance of power in some way, right? On a purely political level. But Leonardo, that's a really good question, because your original question, why don't some of these parties team up? It's a really good one. And the answer is that the electoral system might not present them with the right incentives, and the degree of heterogeneity in the society might prevent them from doing it too, because they might have their own constituencies that they represent. And if those are ethnic groups or local groups, that can sometimes undermine the formation of that more consolidated party system. So the second dimension that we're using to analyze party systems is what we call ideological polarization. And this basically refers to just the ideological differences between the relevant parties in the system. The question is, how much ideological distance spans the outermost parties? How far apart are they on the key issues? And this is a really important question because it gets to the heart of, well, what possibilities exist for the parties on those outer edges to cooperate and to work together? If they have to, can those two parties overcome differences or cooperate in a meaningful way to govern? Do they have it in them to work together, or are those differences too substantial? Are they disqualifying? And so this can change over time, and it does, and it has in Brazil, for example. We'll take a look in a moment at the case of Brazil. But it's a very important question because how much polarization exists will relate to how functional the system can be and how easy it is to form those coalitions. And so in the United States, there's less polarization. We often talk about there being a great deal of polarization. There's really not, actually. There's no viable leftist party. The Democratic Party is a centrist party. The Republican Party is a center-right party, a right party. There's really no left-wing party. If there was an actual viable left-wing party, there would be much more ideological polarization than there actually is. Now, the degree of polarization between the two parties maybe has changed, but the actual space in the distance between the outermost parties is not so substantial as to be a highly polarized system. But a more polarized system, on the other hand, might be like the case of Chile, where you've got left and right party coalitions, these two blocks that sort of represent two poles. And those two blocks are relatively far apart, ideologically speaking. The parties within those blocks are contiguous parties, meaning they share positions that either align or sit alongside each other on certain issues. But the coalitions themselves, which have been referred to as single parties because of how tightly the parties within them cooperate, are very, very far apart. So let's take a look at Brazil. What you'll notice is that over time, the total space between the furthest left party, which is 1, and the furthest right party, which is 10, has basically narrowed. So in 1990, the difference between 1.51 and 8.50 was relatively substantial. But by 2013, the difference had narrowed significantly to a difference of 3.86 on the one hand and 8.25 on the other. So the parties in Brazil on the left and the right have basically come closer together, in other words. That's the point of this data. Each data point suggests that the Brazilian party system saw its parties converge in position. The leftist parties became more right-leaning. The right-leaning parties did not necessarily become more left-leaning. It's just that politics has largely moved to the right in Brazil since 1990. And this is interesting because it shows you that party systems can evolve in unpredictable ways. During this period, the Workers' Party, the PT in particular, was in power for many, many years. And to see the Workers' Party go from relatively far left to further right during a period in time when it governed is very interesting, because ostensibly it didn't need to moderate its agenda. It could rule as a leftist party, but still essentially move to the right pretty substantially over the course of about 23 years. So ideological polarization is falling in Brazil during this period. And this is an interesting outcome, again, because there are a lot of parties in Brazil, and to see the polarization shrinking means that there should be more opportunities and possibilities for cooperation. Oh, BLS wave means Brazilian Legislative Survey. So in 1990, 2001, and 2013, there were different Brazilian legislative surveys that were taken to gauge the positions of the different parties. And this data represents numbers from those surveys. So that's how we know where these parties moved over the span of this period as measured at these different data points. Now, you might be asking, we know that in Peru, fragmentation has made it impossible virtually to reform the system and to push through policy changes and to govern in general. But what are some of the other consequences of aspects of party systems? And ideological polarization, for example, is a very important cause of different political outcomes. And one that I want to suggest to you is attributable to ideological polarization is the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff of Brazil in 2016. As is well known, Dilma Rousseff was impeached not on the basis of corruption allegations, which were also made, but on the basis of allegedly trying to cover up some information in the process of the discovery involved in the corruption allegations. Now, when she was impeached by primarily right-leaning parties. She comes from the Workers' Party, which is a leftist party and the strongest leftist party in Brazil. And this has led many to say that her impeachment was politically motivated by the division between rightist and leftist parties. What that means then is, even though the Workers' Party itself moved to the right, and even though ideological polarization declined in Brazil, the polarization that still exists in the system was sufficient to lead to the impeachment of a leftist party by a coalition of right-leaning parties in the Brazilian legislature. Now, Dilma Rousseff was one of a wave of women presidents in Latin America, and she is an inspiring example because of her leadership and because of her success in winning the presidency. Now, her impeachment is also an example, certainly, of ideological polarization and how it becomes consequential. So let's watch some videos that puts this in perspective. I'll bring this up here and start a new share. Give me just a moment. Oh, just a minute, everyone. Here we go.
The beleaguered Brazilian president is facing an almost perfect economic and political storm, for which a large proportion of the population here blames her directly. Perhaps the biggest crisis affecting her is a multi-billion-dollar corruption scandal focused on the state-controlled oil giant Petrobras. Dilma Rousseff used to be chairman of the board at Petrobras, and although, unlike other senior politicians and business leaders, she has not been directly implicated in the scandal, it has weakened her authority and that of a government. And that is why many Brazilians think she should either resign or be impeached. This is a critical week for the president's opponents in Congress as they try to drum up the necessary two-thirds majority to begin the impeachment process. But it's important to note, impeachment has nothing to do with the aforementioned corruption scandal at the state-controlled oil giant Petrobras. Instead, it is more focused on allegations that Dilma Rousseff somehow manipulated government accounts to hide the growing deficit. And that is why the president and his supporters say that what is happening in Congress is nothing more than an attempted coup against a democratically elected government. Yes, in the last decade, Brazil was the...
Okay, so they're going to talk a little bit about the economic situation. I'm not as interested in that because we don't care as much about that. Let me bring up a new share. Watch another video.
The moment of victory. Thousands of pro-impeachment supporters, clad in the national colours of green and gold, celebrating after one of the most important yet divisive political battles since the return of democracy to Brazil 30 years ago. For 5 long hours they'd watched on giant screens as members of Congress voted one after the other in favour of impeaching the president. Invoking God, their families and patriotism, few actually mentioned the charges of hiding the scale of the deficit of which Ms. Rousseff is formally being accused. Many of these congressmen, including the powerful Speaker Eduardo Cunha, are accused of far more serious crimes, including money laundering and corruption. Some protesters who supported impeaching the president say she is just the start.
First, we want Dilma out of the government, and then Cunha, Temer, Renan Calheiros, a lot of leaders who are involved in corruption.
This victory for those in favour of impeachment is a huge personal blow against Dilma herself. It makes it even more likely a full impeachment trial in the Senate and her suspension from the presidency. It also could be the beginning of the end of 12 years of leftist Workers' Party rule in Brazil. The mood among those who'd opposed impeachment was flat. Predominantly working class and many from mixed race backgrounds, they fear a change of government, if Ms. Rousseff is impeached, would be a step backwards for a country that's made great social progress.
Vai ter luta, a luta está começando agora.
Our fight continues. It's just starting now, says this former oil worker who supports the government. If the opposition thinks they can do just what they want, he says, they're wrong. We'll go to the streets. Brazil feels tense and divided. The thousands of troops on hand in Brasilia to keep the camps apart weren't needed, with one side defeated, the other jubilant. But there'll be no quick fix to the country's political and economic woes. Willa Davis, BBC News, Brasilia.
So the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil is really a case study in ideological polarization in the Congress, in the party system. Dilma Rousseff was the leader of the Workers' Party, the leftist party, and it was primarily a coalition of rightist parties, the main opposition to the leftist administration, who impeached her. And in that regard, it was a very divisive impeachment proceeding, and it seemed to underscore the polarization that does persist in the Brazilian legislature. It does have a high degree of party system fragmentation, much like Ecuador and Peru. Despite the workability of coalitions in the legislature that presidents form, that party system fragmentation has been very consequential, and this is one more way that it has been. I'm going to read a few more comments here. Looks like all the substantive comments have been made. We are out of time, everyone. We'll finish up this lecture on Wednesday, and we'll begin the next unit in the course about presidential powers. I'm going to stop recording. You are free to go. Thank you very much for being here, and I'll see you on Wednesday.